a husband is returning home from an early morning workout and calls the police as he's just a few minutes away, asking them to check on his family since his wife hasn't answered his calls or texts all morning. He's concerned, given that he's recently been receiving death threats towards his wife and young sons. So why would he risk leaving them alone, and why the urgency now that he's just minutes away from being home? Come find out as we explore this high-profile case as you've never seen it. Today, we'll be talking about the Coleman family murders and how 3 innocent people's lives were selfishly stolen from them. You'll learn how the killer laid what is now an obvious trail of breadcrumbs on his lengthy journey to the killings. Christopher Coleman, known as Chris to family and friends, was born in 1977 to parents Ron and Connie Coleman, both Christian evangelical pastors. Chris had 2 brothers but was the quietest and most reserved of the bunch. In junior high, he was described as very kind, a team player, and someone who never lost his temper. In high school, Chris was inspired when a U.S. Marine Corps recruiter visited his school, which led him to join the Marines right out of high school. It was there where 20-year-old Chris, attending a K-9 training seminar at an Air Force base in San Antonio, met 20-year-old Sheri Weiss, who was, at the time, an Air Force military police officer attending a training. Sheri was born to parents Angela DeSicco and Donald Weiss in 1977 as well, and was raised in Cook County, Illinois. In 1998, Chris brought Sheri to Chester, Illinois to meet his parents. From the start, Sheri didn't impress Chris's Christian parents. Chris's father, Ron Coleman, recalled that she was a worldly little girl, little short shorts, a tattoo on her leg. Not the person we thought he'd be with. The couple had eloped in Chicago just one day before that meeting. Chris's parents would later claim that Chris immediately regretted it, stating that he was repentant. After the elopement, Chris's parents learned that Sheri was pregnant. Chris and Sheri welcomed their first son, Garrett, in 1998, and his second son, Gavin, in 2000. The family settled into a comfortable 2-story home in Columbia, Illinois, not far from Chris's parents in Chester. Chris landed a job as a personal bodyguard for Joyce Meyer of Joyce Meyer Ministries. Joyce knew the Colemans and was a popular televangelist and head of an international Christian ministry. Joyce originally hired Chris to work on her security team, but he was soon promoted to be her personal bodyguard, earning a salary of $100,000 per year as he traveled with her worldwide for speaking engagements. The extensive travel had its pros and cons, the main con being that he was traveling more often than he was home, which caused friction between him and Sheri. Adding to the friction was Sheri's complaint that Chris was not affectionate. She confided in one friend that after she and Chris were intimate on a certain occasion, which hardly ever occurred, he told her afterward not to take it to mean that he loved her. And there were also arguments about money, with Chris being the only person bringing in an income and Sheri enjoying shopping and donating to charities. Tensions regarding money mounted. Despite Sheri's grievances, she shared with friends that she loved Chris too much to give up on their marriage. Then in 2008, their marriage took a turn for the worse. Chris shared with friends that he was planning to divorce Sheri after the holidays. Around the same time, Sheri told friends that she suspected that Chris was having an affair with an old high school friend of hers that she had introduced him to. She even told one friend bitterly, "You want to see the woman my husband's having an affair with?" as she pulled up a photo of a woman named Tara Lintz on Facebook. But still, Sheri wanted to make their marriage work. It was toward the end of that same year, on November 14, 2008, that Chris also started receiving threatening emails and letters expressing extreme animosity and hatred toward Joyce Meyer. But strangely, instead of threatening Joyce, the letters threatened harm against Chris and his family. The message read in part, "Tell Joyce to stop preaching the bullshit or Chris's family will die. If I can't get to Joyce, then I will get to someone closer. If I can't get to him, then I will kill his wife and kids." Chris shared the threats with police. And since a detective sergeant happened to live across the street from Chris, he set up a surveillance camera to watch Chris's house and mailbox. Patrol cars also began patrolling his home frequently. The threatening messages came regularly until April 27th, with a final letter that read, in part, "I'm giving you the last warning. Stop today or else. I'm in your schedule. You can't hide from me forever. I'm always watching. Your worst nightmare is about to happen." It's the morning of May 5th, 2009. Chris left his home on Robert Drive at 5:43 a.m. to go work out at a gym across the river in St. Louis. Rather than wake her before he left, he called his wife, Sheri, at 5:43 as he was pulling out of the driveway to make sure she was awake. She didn't answer. He then texted her several times afterward with no response. His last text read, "Are you awake? I know you was tired last night. I have about 5 minutes left on cardio, then I'll be home. Hello, you up? Time to get the kids up." Chris would later tell police that he was worried that Sheri wasn't answering, even though he went on to complete the cardio workout he referred to, then work out an additional 15 minutes after that. At 6:43, on his way home from working out, Chris called his detective neighbor, Detective Sergeant Justin Barlow, and asked him to check on Sheri and the boys, concerned that he wasn't getting a response. He told Barlow that he was on his way home and was just about 5 minutes away. Cell tower records show that after that call, he actually drove past his highway exit and made an additional call to the Columbia Police Department, asking them to check on his family as well. Barlow meets an officer from the Columbia Police Department at the Coleman home. They quickly find that a basement window at the back of the house is open and its screen is out. They immediately call for backup and enter the home through the open window, where they instantly smell the fumes of spray paint. Then, sprawled on the walls are numerous red spray-painted messages, including, "I am always watching, you have paid and punished," among profanities and other messages. Chris arrives home at 6:56 a.m., having taken 13 minutes to complete what should have been just a 5-minute drive. Police advise him to wait outside as they proceed through the home, confident that whatever else they find can't be good. Soon after, they discover the bodies of 31-year-old Sheri, 11-year-old Garrett, and 9-year-old Gavin, all strangled. The officers inform Chris that his family didn't make it, but nothing further. Chris doesn't ask what happened, who did it, how they died, or forced to be allowed in. He sits on the ground and begins to sob. He then calls his father. At the scene, observers notice scratches on Chris's arms and bring it to the attention of the officers. And shortly afterward, as Chris is being consoled in an ambulance, he looks down, red marks on his right arm, and asks. He then proceeds to start banging his fists on the gurney so he can later claim that that's how he acquired the scratches. Chris was brought to the Columbia Police Department for questioning, where he gave his account on what happened that morning.
Well, I set my alarm clock for 5:30 and I used my phone for my alarm clock. And got up at 5:30, went in the bathroom, put these clothes here I got on, and went to the bathroom and basically got in the truck and left. And drove off. I got to, I don't know where I was at, but called Sheri to wake her up, get her going, and she didn't answer, of course. And so I went on to the gym, to Gold's Gym, and over by Ronnie's Plaza in South County, and started working out. I text her at some point. I might even called her again. I don't remember. I could probably look at my phone if you want me to.
Do you guys have a home phone number too, or just cell phones?
No, we just use cell phones. So I text her, and then she still didn't respond, and probably now it had to have been well after 6 o'clock sometime when I texted her or called her. I'm sure it's still on her phone what time it was.
Okay.
And she didn't respond, and it's not like her because the kids should have been up and stuff, or getting up and going by then, I believe. And so I called her again. On the way back, or when I was getting ready to leave, and she didn't respond again, and I started getting a little concerned because it's not like her not to answer the phone. Sometimes she won't answer if she's in the shower, but she always calls me back right away. And so she didn't do that at all. And so that's when I called.
During the interrogation, Chris mentioned he was cold and requested a blanket from the officers. The officers brought him a blanket, but once he received it, the only part of his body he covered up was his scratched arm. Chris also never asked during the interrogation or otherwise whether his own security system or the neighbor's security system had been checked to see if the killer had been recorded. But police had already checked the neighbor's footage and were aware that no one either came to or from the Coleman home other than Chris. They asked Chris if he had any marital problems, and he said he didn't. He admitted to having a close friend, Tara Lintz, that Sheri introduced him to in November of the prior year, 2008, but that they were just friends. Tara Lintz was already being interrogated in Florida. She acknowledged that they were indeed having an affair and that they planned to marry the following year. He would have just told Ed that he was working. She also shared that Chris planned to serve Sheri divorce papers on that very day, the day that she ended up being murdered. During Chris's interrogation, findings from the search and early analysis of physical evidence were constantly being delivered to the officers conducting the interrogation. So they knew early on that the victim's time of death was well before Chris stated that he left the home. Police used their expert interrogation strategies to try to get Chris to acknowledge what was becoming more and more clear.
We need to know what happened. We can't keep going on this. It didn't, she was alive when I left. We know that's not true, and there's nothing we can do about changing that. If we know she wasn't alive when you left this morning, there's got to be an explanation. Now is the time to tell us. Now is the time to get this out in the open.
I don't know what else to tell you.
Yes, you do. Yes,
No.
you do. You have to tell me the truth, Chris.
I'm telling you the truth.
Were you involved in her death?
No.
Okay.
Chris would not confess. So while the information pouring in was squarely pointing at Chris as the murderer, there wasn't enough evidence yet to charge and hold him. So after 6 long hours of interrogation, Chris was free to leave. A funeral was held for Sheri, Gavin, and Garrett on May 9th at Evergreen Cemetery in Chester. A few days after the funeral, Sheri's family had the bodies brought to a suburb of Chicago for visitation. Chris did not attend that service. And by mid-May, just a couple of weeks after the murders, family and friends were disgusted when they found that Chris had dismantled and thrown away the memorial and tribute that mourners had accumulated outside their front yard, along with having moved out numerous boxes of their belongings. Meanwhile, detectives with the Major Case Squad were building their case. Once the evidence was gathered and all the forensic results were in, a clear picture emerged, riddled with damning evidence against Chris. Chris began having an affair with his wife's friend Tara starting in November of 2008, evidenced by 2 rendezvous that they had in Arizona and Hawaii, as well as X-rated texts, pictures, and hundreds of videos featuring themselves. They had plans to marry in January 2010. The Colemans had a trip to Disney World planned for July 2009. Tara wasn't happy about that, and as she would later testify, she told Chris that she didn't want him to go. She stated, "Chris told me he canceled it, but that Sheri had rescheduled it for the fall. I posed as Sheri in a call to Disney World to check." Chris planned a cruise with Tara to the Virgin Islands in place of the Disney trip. In the summer of 2008, Sheri texts a friend that Chris had beat her and later that he wanted to leave her. Sheri stated that Chris was furious, and Sheri messaged the same friend that Chris said that. A friend of Chris's recalled him complaining about his shotgun marriage and that he worked 80 to 90 hours a week protecting some millionaire lady I don't even like, while my old lady gets to sit at home in this nice big house. He went on to say that, "I'm making $100,000 a year and I've got to drive around in a clunker," the friend said. Chris often talked about not wanting to be with Sheri, but not knowing what to do, and that if he got divorced, he'd lose his job. After Christmas that year, Sheri confides in friends that Chris wants a divorce and that she and the kids were in the way. Friends noticed the pain and worry that Sheri was going through around that time, but one friend noted that by early April, Sheri was entirely different, bubbly, and happy. She'd pick up the phone, excited and giddy whenever Chris called. At church 3 days before the murders, she and Chris even answered the altar call invitation for a marriage blessing and went up to the altar to receive it. And then, May 4th, 2009, the night before the murders. A neighbor reported that Garrett was supposed to stay the night at their home for her son's birthday, stating, "It was a tradition for Garrett Coleman to come over for my son's birthday. Garrett was supposed to come over one night, but later said he couldn't. I recall him saying, 'Dad said tonight is not a good night.'" On May 5, 2009, Chris Coleman awakes about 5:30 a.m., gets dressed, and leaves home, headed for the gym. To establish his alibi, he starts phoning and texting Sheri the moment he leaves, and throughout his workout too, to wake her, a practice he had no record of doing in the past. On the way home, Chris makes the calls to Detective Barlow and to the police station, all while uncharacteristically taking a bizarrely long road home. Police, Chris, his father, and Joyce Meyer assemble at the home while the bodies are discovered inside. When Chris's father asks Chris if there's anyone he should call for him, he replies, "Yes, Tara Lintz." Chris texts Tara himself just a few hours after the murder. No one calls Sheri Coleman's family to tell them of her or the boys' deaths for days. The time of death of the Coleman family is confirmed to be well before Chris left for the gym in the morning. Detectives called on the expertise of world-famous pathologist Michael Baden, who starred in his own HBO series Autopsy. Baden placed the time of death likely close to 3 a.m., and depending on factors, possibly even earlier than that. But he stated it was most certainly before Chris left the home. Upon examining Chris's bank statements from 3 months prior, police learned that Chris had purchased the exact brand of spray paint and color, Candy Apple Red, that was used to write the messages on the walls. Chris would claim that the killer found the spray paint in their home and used it. The threatening letters and emails contained misspellings that Chris routinely made in past communications of his, including misspelling opportunities in several of the threatening messages. DNA found under Sheri's fingernails was consistent with Chris Coleman's DNA, but was not a definitive match. Based on the IP address where the threatening emails originated, the cybercrimes unit determined they were sent from Chris Coleman's laptop using his login information. Chris Coleman was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. After several lengthy delays, the trial finally began on April 25, 2011, in Waterloo, Illinois. Jurors were selected from a different county to avoid any claims of a tainted jury. The evidence was presented and multiple witnesses were called to testify, including Joyce Meyer. She testified about the possibility of Chris losing his job.
Now, I have to ask you, if the defendant were having an affair, if you had known that at the time, and I understand you've testified that you didn't, what effect would that have had on his employment?
If he would have been having an adulterous affair while he was still married, then it could have definitely affected his job.
Okay. Were there persons over the years that were terminated in situations like that?
We had situations where they were, yes.
Now I have to ask you about the distinction here. What if it was a divorce as opposed to an adulterous affair?
Each situation is handled totally separately based on the circumstances. We have many people that work for us that have been divorced, and a person is not necessarily, do they lose their job because they get a divorce. It wouldn't have been the divorce so much as the immorality.
So for instance, if a person in your employment, if their spouse filed for divorce against them, and perhaps they had little control over that, you might leave them in your employment? That's a possibility?
Certainly.
Okay, and on the other end of the spectrum, if a person was having an adulterous affair and then filed for divorce from their spouse to be with that person, then their employment may have been terminated.
May have been, yes.
Okay. Do you think there was any situations of that in the past where someone was actually terminated under those kind of circumstances?
I believe so.
Okay.
The prosecution fought to get the text messages and conversations between Sheri and friends admitted as evidence to help prove Chris's motive. Chris's defense argued that the messages and conversations were hearsay and violated the Sixth Amendment right to cross-examine witnesses. The prosecution responded, if Coleman wanted to confront his wife in court, he shouldn't have killed her. Any right to cross-examine was forfeited when Coleman killed her. The defense's strategy? To assert that someone hacked Chris's computer to send the threatening messages and sneak into the family's home to commit the murders. Chris Coleman did not take the stand during the 9-day trial. On May 5, 2011, the 2-year anniversary of the murders, after 15 hours of deliberation over 2 days, a jury returned the verdicts, guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. After the case was over, a juror reported they thought the jury was going to be a hung jury until they inspected a photo of Chris and Tara, finding a printed date on the back of October 28, 2008. At that point, they realized the couple had been having an affair before they admitted they had, which increased the likelihood of Chris plotting the murder and fabricating the threatening messages as a result of the affair. Days after the conviction, Chris waived his right to be sentenced by the jury and put his fate in the hands of the judge. The judge sentenced Chris to 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Even if the judge had sentenced Chris to death, it wouldn't have mattered since the governor of Illinois had just signed legislation a few months prior to that outlawing the death penalty. On May 4, 2011, a day before Coleman's verdict was handed down, a wrongful death civil lawsuit was filed on behalf of Sheri Coleman and her 2 sons against Joyce's ministry, and Joyce's son, who Sheri had reported the threatening messages to. The case was originally dismissed, with the Illinois judge claiming there was no way for the ministry to foresee that Coleman would have gone on to kill his family. On appeal, however, a court sided with Sheri's family, basically asserting that the threats were so extreme that it was reasonable to anticipate that harm may come to the family and that the ministry was responsible for investigating the threats and protecting the family from them. In addition to the lawsuit, Sheri's family also wanted Sheri and the boys' bodies moved back to their hometown and out of the hometown of their murderer and his family. Chris and his family fought to try to keep their bodies in Chester, but a judge decided that a convicted murderer should not have control over where his victims were laid to rest. If they were to have remained in Chester, Chris's body would ultimately have been laid right next to the family he murdered whenever his time came. In December 2012, the bodies of Sheri, Gavin, and Garrett were exhumed from their graves at Evergreen Cemetery in Chester and relocated to Sheri's hometown just outside Chicago. The gravestone marking Sheri and her boys remained at Evergreen Cemetery because it had been paid for by Ron and Connie Coleman. Ron and Connie Coleman were convinced of their son's innocence throughout the ordeal. They even blamed Sheri for Chris's affair, claiming she never complimented him and was always criticizing him for not being affectionate. In an April 2018 interview with Crime Watch Daily, Chris maintained his innocence and claimed he was set up. On the same program, Chris's father, Ron Coleman, also proclaimed his son's innocence, adding that an affair would not have been a motive for the murders. He stated, "Tara was just meeting a need at the time that Sheri wasn't taken care of." Ron continued, "Well, I mean, every man has his desires and every man has to be respected. It's built into every man. If your wife doesn't respect you, then you're going to find respect someplace else." Connie Coleman passed away in June 2020. Chris Coleman was originally incarcerated at Pontiac Correctional Center near Chicago, then later that year, transferred to Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin for safety reasons, specifically because of an interstate agreement that allows prisoners in high-profile cases to transfer out of the state for safety reasons. In both 2014 and 2018, Chris's attorneys requested a new trial, claiming the dates on the back of those photos that led jurors to decide to convict were not in the allowed evidence. A judge granted an evidentiary hearing in 2019, but ultimately denied the appeal for a new trial. And in September 2020, a remote hearing was held during the COVID pandemic that should have exhausted Coleman's post-conviction appeal and relief options. So Chris Coleman is slated to remain in prison for life. What are your thoughts on Chris Coleman and his ability to strangle not just children, but his own children? We pretty much have one thought about him, so we'll add him to that appropriate playlist. We also have thoughts about Tara, same playlist. But what we also can't help commenting on is how some killers think they're so clever, spend months on the perfect plan, then produce exactly the opposite, riddled with transparent evidence throughout. Please share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to see more videos like this one, please be sure to hit like and definitely hit subscribe so you never miss a single video.